This video describes how to change your calendar sync URL. You would need to do this if your team is changing from one calendar to another, and that includes changing between different calendar providers. So for example, we've seen a few teams that are using the League Athletics website, which has now been sunsetted, and users are being migrated to SportsEngine. So the teams are now using a different calendar. The old calendar is no longer being maintained, and so they need to change MadPuck to refer to the new calendar. So you should use this feature if the two calendars are similar. Now there may be some changes as the calendars may have already been updated, which is fine. But if this is a completely new calendar, so for example, if this is a new team, then I'd strongly suggest creating a new team in MadPuck. And you can use the duplicate team feature, which allows you to keep all of your existing players and fans in order to create that new team from your existing team. But if this team is the same team as before, and you just want to change the calendar sync URL, it's best to just make that change directly in the calendar sync settings so you can keep all your game history and stats. So to change your calendar sync URL, you're going to go to the More tab, and you're going to choose Calendar Sync. You'll notice the calendar sync is enabled, and there's a URL in the text field there. So you're going to remove that. It's a little bit awkward on iOS to remove it, but select and remove. And you'll notice that the toggle button turns off at that point because there's nothing in the URL. You're going to paste in the URL for the new team, turn on calendar sync, and hit save. And then within a few seconds, the schedule will be automatically updated for you. So when you change the calendar sync URLs, you may be wondering, will I receive a bunch of duplicate events? And for the large part, the answer is no, as long as the calendars are very similar. There's a few rules that we use in order to do this migration. So any practices that are in common between the two calendars, that means the same date and the same start time, will be converted to practices managed by the new calendar. So you would not receive any duplicates there. Any games in any games in common, same date and start time, will be converted to games managed by the new calendar. And those events, similarly with the practices, will be updated to the most recent information in the new calendar. So for example, if your opponent changed between the two, the new opponent will be reflected. And any events that fall outside of these rules are kept. So make sure you review the end result carefully to make sure you're happy with everything. So in that case, for example, if you had a user-created event that wasn't managed by the old calendar and it's not in the new calendar, it'll still be there once you change the calendar sync URL. And one other point around the migration of events: for games and practices that are in common and that are migrated, the attendance responses that you've already gathered for those events will be kept and reflected in the new calendar. So just to clarify the definition of a managed event by the calendar, what that means is that if the event changes on the back end calendar, so for example, your scheduler changes something on your team's calendar on your website or in your backend web app, those changes will automatically be reflected within MadPuck. So those are what we call managed events. User-created events are ones that are created directly in MadPuck and are not affected by any calendar sync operation. Now, if you do have a user-created event, it may be converted to a managed event if that same event is added on your backend calendar. So if it occurs at the same time and it's of the same type, so practice versus practice, game versus game, then it'll be automatically converted to a managed event from that point on. So you can tell which events are managed by the calendar sync versus ones that are not, so the user-created events, by looking at the calendar sync icon. So if we start by taking a look at the event, the game on the 6th versus the Philadelphia Blazers, we click on that, and then on the top right you see the little cloud icon with the 2 arrows coming out of it. That means it's a managed event. This on Android, this is in a slightly different location. It's on the left-hand side below the address. So keep an eye out for that there on Android. This is on Apple phones. Let's go back and now let's take a look at that user created event. And here you'll notice there is no Cloud Sync icon. So this is not a managed event. As it relates to changing the calendar sync URL, if you see then event does not have the calendar sync icon, then it falls into one of three categories. A, it was a user created event that was never in either of the calendars. B, an event that was managed by the old calendar and is no longer being managed by the new calendar. So for example, the game was removed between the calendars. And C, the event start date has changed, and I'll provide a few more details on that in a moment as an example. After you change the calendar sync URL, you can use the calendar sync icon to determine which events are managed versus unmanaged. Any unmanaged events will not be updated by the calendar sync, and the calendar sync occurs automatically about 4 times a day. Let's look at an example. So you have a game in the old calendar at 6 a.m. and the game has changed to 7 a.m. in the new calendar. If you change the URL at this point, then you'll end up with 2 events, one at 6 a.m. and one at 7 a.m. because the start times don't match. And then you'll need to manually remove the old event. Recall that you can look for the calendar sync icon to help you determine which one is the old unmanaged event. Now, you'll also lose any attendance responses that were received against the old 6 a.m. event, which may or may not be what you want. If you do want to keep the attendance responses, then before you change the calendar sync URL, you should change the start time of the event. So in this case, change it from 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. so that the old event will be migrated and managed by the new calendar when you make the URL change. This may sound a little complicated, but in practice it shouldn't be because the calendars are likely to be very similar, so there should not be many events that differ between the two. This can be simplified to 3 simple steps. Number 1, compare the MadPuck events against the new calendar on your team's website. Update the events in MadPuck to match the start time of the events in the new calendar. Number 2, change the calendar sync URL. The calendar will sync after a few seconds. And finally, number 3, verify everything looks good by comparing the MadPuck events against the new calendar and remove any unmanaged events you don't want. Any changes to managed events should be made against the master schedule, not in MadPuck, and then those changes will be automatically synced to MadPuck. That's it for this video. We'll see you at the rink.